so happy to see everybody. This is great to have such a packed house. It's wonderful. I mean, it's really wonderful. And hello to the live stream folks as well. I'm Carolyn Waters, the head librarian here at the New York Society Library. And we are just delighted to have Elizabeth Winthrop and Tim Gunn here to discuss Elizabeth's new book, Daughter of Spies. It's her first memoir, by the way, which I did not realize. And those of us who have been following the story on the blog we're really glad to finally get the whole picture in this book. So, but you should also follow her blog because it's really excellent. And actually, somebody out here actually has my copy. I don't know I can't remember who I lent it to, but I have not gotten it back, and that's okay. I'm just going to ask that if you are the person who has my copy, just pass it along, because it is a thoroughly engrossing read. This wonderful story about this family during Cold War Washington, secrets and intrigue, and it's really a delicious book. So. Let me tell you a little bit about the folks we have here today, although some of you, I think, know them quite well. Elizabeth Winthrop Alsop is the author of over 60 works of fiction for all ages. I actually thought that was a typo, but that is actually true. Her work includes the novels Island Justice and In My Mother's House. Her fantasy novels for children, The Castle in the Attic and The Battle for the Castle, are considered classics of the genre, and I just learned 2 minutes ago that she's finished a prequel, so we have that to look forward to as well. The Little Darters was selected by, her story, The Little Darters, was selected by Robert Stone as one of the best American short stories, and is now included in Symphony Space's Little Rebellions program, which is guest hosted by Roxane Gay, so you should check that out as well. Oh, and she's a longtime member of the New York Society Library. Save that for last. And a shareholder.
And a shareholder.
We could not ask for a better interlocutor for this conversation with Elizabeth than Tim Gunn. Tim is also a New York Society Library member and a very good friend of Elizabeth's. So he knows a lot about her. He can get all the stories out. He also happens to be the son of an FBI agent and a CIA librarian. So how's that for synchronicity here? It's kind of great. However, you all probably know him best as the Emmy Award-winning co-host of the Amazon Prime series Making the Cut, which just aired its third season. And also, of course, 16 seasons of Project Runway. He is a New York Times best-selling author and also a former teacher, administrator, and chair of the Department of Fashion Design at Parsons School of Design. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim and Elizabeth.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was lovely. I have never interviewed an author whom I knew personally. And Elizabeth is a first for me, and I've interviewed a lot of authors, but I thought I should deliver something of a preamble about how we know each other. And it's a very curious story, I have to say, because Elizabeth and I are both Washingtonians. We grew up in the same neighborhood, literally just a few blocks from each other. You and your brothers and I all went to the same elementary school, Beauvoir, the National Cathedral. I never knew Elizabeth or any of her brothers when I was growing up. So I moved, oh, and I have to add, my radar was always up for the Alsops. The Alsops were and are Washington royalty. I mean, it's an incredibly distinguished name and with an incredible history, a lot of which we read about in your book. So I moved to New York in 1983, and in 2009, when the real estate market sort of bottomed out, I bought my first, and I will add last, apartment. And where is it? It's 1 block from where Elizabeth and her husband Jason live. So I began to frequent our local diner, and I, of course, was taking note of the regulars, and Elizabeth and Jason were certainly among the regulars. But we never exchanged words. So I believe it was a Saturday, I'm sitting across the aisle in a booth for 2, and Elizabeth and Jason are in a booth for 4 up against the wall, and I'm hearing Elizabeth updating Jason on the status, this is 2015, the status of the disastrous earthquake in Nepal. and specifically about her brother Ian. And I'm eavesdropping because this is quite a topic at the time. So I actually call out to you, is your brother all right?
It's true.
And we've been fast friends ever since. But it took until 2015 for us to actually connect, even though there was so much connective tissue that was at play beforehand, but it just never stuck.
The funniest thing was that that's Tim's memory of our meeting. My memory is that I'm in the diner and our favorite Peruvian waitress, Stephanie, you know, would take care of us every morning or whatever. And one day I said to her, Stephanie, who is that guy who walks in here dressed to the nines? And she said, that's Tim Gunn. I said, well, who's Tim Gunn? I think Tim likes that about me.
I love it about you.
I didn't know what
Never
to say.
change.
So we are fast friends. We meet for breakfast at least once a week, and many other things.
And many other things we do.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth, your book, I'm now reading it for the second time because it is so content filled that it's, at least for me in my waning years, it's difficult for me to absorb all of it at once. And of course, I can picture everything. I know where you are, and I know what was happening around the time. But I'd love to know, as I'm certain we all would, what was your catalyst for writing the book?
So I think what really happened was I wrote a novel called Counting on Grace, which was a historical novel. And it was based on a photograph of a little girl that Lewis Hine, the great child labor photographer, had taken. And after I finished the book, I thought I didn't write about that child. I just used her picture to spur me on. And after I finished the book, I thought, this is really not fair. I really need to know what happened to her. So I did a lot of research, and I found out what happened to her and met her granddaughter who had never seen the picture. The photograph was on a Nike ad. It was on a stamp. I mean, it was an incredibly iconic picture. And after that was all over, I thought, my heavens, I know more about Addie Card than I do about my own mother. So that was a shock. I had, you know, my mother was a very good helpmeet in the 50s, but she was very quiet. She kept her secrets. She kept her silence. And she kept her silence about her time during in London during the war. There were sort of family lore about Daddy meeting Mummy and things like that. But it suddenly troubled me that my father was so famous and had everything written about him, and she was only a footnote. And I thought, I want to tell her story. So I began to interview her. And then I videotaped her twice, once about her childhood in Gibraltar and once about her time in London during the war. And that got the whole project going. And I thought, well, I could write a novel, because it was a great love affair, you know, London during the war, bombs dropping, etc. But I couldn't do it because I wasn't there. And it just drove me crazy after a while. I didn't know quite enough, and yet I felt like I wanted the real story to come out.
Well, it seems to me it's much more powerful than a novel would be.
I think it is.
Because we're thinking, someone made this up.
Yeah.
You didn't make this up. This is true.
Yeah.
This happened. And your mother's no longer a footnote.
No, that's what I wanted more than anything. And, you know, at the end she had dementia, and at one point she said to somebody else at tea, my daughter is writing my autobiography.
Like Alice B. Toklas.
Right, exactly. And I said, yes, Mommy, that is what I'm doing. But, you know, I think about it a lot because there's a lot in there she wouldn't be happy about. I mean, she came to terms with her life at the end, but it had to be a very honest book.
Yes.
And there was no other way to do it.
And don't you believe, I'm asking a leading question, that if it is honest, that the subject is going to have not the most attractive reaction?
Yeah, it's absolutely standard. I wrote a novel called Knock Knock Who's There, not the best title, but anyway. about two boys whose father dies of a blood disease, and after he dies, they discover their mother's an alcoholic. And my father died of a blood disease, and my mother was an alcoholic. And we had a come to Jesus, 8 hours in an apartment together, going over that material. She was deeply upset.
It's in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book. And she was in AA by that time, and I'll never forget, she told me, she said at the AA meeting, you know, my daughter's written a book about my drinking, and I'm writing her a letter. And the AA meeting people said, well, where does she live? Hong Kong? You know, Japan? Well, no, she lives in New York. Well, why don't you go see her? Oh, she said, I hadn't thought of that. Because, of course, you know, we didn't talk like that. So she called me up and she said, so, darling, I'm coming to see you about the book. I said, do you have to? Couldn't you write me a letter? And there was a moment in that whole very tough conversation, which I'll never forget. She said, I understand why you wrote the book. I don't understand why you published it. And I was very quiet, and then she said, I take that back. She said, I was married to a writer. I understand. So, but it was a very poignant time. So.
Well, you know this, but I'll share it with everyone else because we are pals.
Yeah.
I wrote a book that my mother had a very bad reaction to, and she wrote me, I don't know how many pages. A large manila envelope arrived. It was probably an inch thick. That was years ago. I still haven't opened it, and I'm not going to.
I think you are amazing. I would have had to open it, but I think you're amazing.
I don't want to know, and I don't
Yeah.
think I need to know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I get it. I get it.
So when you began Daughter of Spies, did you know your mother would be the centerpiece? Was that that was the...
I was pretty sure about that. Oh, no, actually, what happened was I went to see this fabulous guy, William Zinsser, who wrote On Writing Well. And I said, I've decided to write a memoir about my parents. And he just shook his head. He said, you can't. I said, what do you mean I can't? He said, you can't write about both of them.
Oh,
You have to
interesting.
pick one. And I thought, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. And I left, and 2 years later, I agreed. I had to pick one of them. It was, the thing fell apart if I was trying to write about both of them. And after all, Daddy had he'd been written about, there was a play about him, he had written his own memoir. It's like his story was told, you know. And I thought, no, I really want to know my mother's story. And the only way to really know it was to keep digging.
Though your father is inextricable from the book.
Right, he's
yeah,
definitely in there.
absolutely.
But it's not a political book,
No.
as you know. And it's not a book about, you know, what did Daddy say to Dick Bissell about the U2, or it's none of that, because I was too busy in my childhood just trying to keep myself safe, trying to kind of keep my younger brothers safe from my mother's very erratic behavior. My father traveled endlessly. He always left on my birthday in September and came back at Christmas. Because Daddy worked with Uncle Joe in a column. They wrote a column together called Matter of Fact, and at the height of their fame, they hit 28 million readers.
Good
which
heavens.
is amazing. And Uncle Joe said, if you're going to be a full partner, you have to travel half the year, and I will travel half the year. So they would go for 3-month times, and usually very far away. I mean, you know, Far East, Russia, Moscow, etc. So Mommy had to hold down the fort.
How did you cope?
I have a brother here who would say I was slightly over-controlling.
This is Elizabeth's
This is
brother,
my
Stuart.
brother, Stuart. Younger brother. I coped the way I think most children of alcoholics cope, which is to try and keep a constant eye on everything that was going on. Constantly thinking, okay, a perfect example, my brother Ian, who's one, I have 5, and Ian's one just slightly older than me, and he would meet me at the door coming home from St. Albans, and he would, in the back door, because I came from Bethesda, Maryland, so it was farther away, my school was, and he would go like this or like this. This meant, it's okay, we can be in the house, we can, you know. This meant scatter. Go hide, because Mommy was off the rails. She never drank openly. She drank Cokes with vodka in it because she thought you couldn't smell it.
And she thought no one knew?
We children didn't know. I mean, Daddy never told us. We tossed around words like schizophrenic. You know, we thought, oh, that sounds like the right word, you know, because she would be all on or all off. She was also a chemical alcoholic. That meant she would drink for a month and be dry for a year, and then drink for a year and be dry for a week. So you just never knew. There were certain things. She only smoked when she drank.
Interesting.
So that was one thing. She also had this thing she did with her hair that all of the kids can imitate, where she would take her hair and constantly go like this with it, and that meant she was drinking. But we didn't know it was drinking. We just knew she was angry, or she was erratic, or she was unpredictable. So that's coping. I think most children of alcoholics cope by just trying to avoid the minefields.
But it has to take a toll on you and,
Huge.
of course, on your brothers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a huge toll. And very, very end of her life, she never actually said, I'm sorry, but she clearly felt deeply sad about what she had missed by that. I mean, she came to this country 18. She met my father when she was 16 and he was 28. They got married just after a V1 raid in London. She was 18, he was 30. She lost her first child during another V1 raid in London during the war. She was anemic. She recovered from that. My father had dropped behind enemy lines into France. She was working as a decoding agent for MI5. He comes back. He gets her pregnant again. She's Catholic. That's why she had birthed 7 children. I had a baby sister who died and conceived 12. So it just shows you what the religion did for her. And she had to cross the North Atlantic in convoy at the age of 18, pregnant with our oldest brother, Joe, because there was a bizarre rule in England during those times, during war, that if the in utero baby was 4 months old, you had to stay until the baby was 2. And that was, they didn't want that.
No.
So she left everybody. My father, her best friend, her parents, her only brother had been killed by the Germans in the war in North Africa. She got on this boat. She crossed the North Atlantic in convoy, dodging U-boats, 7 women and 1 8-year-old boy in the same room. And the 8-year-old boy had German measles. And she got German measles, which we never knew until our oldest brother, Joe, was 29 and had a stroke. And the doctor said, check your mother's in utero experience. So Joe calls up and Mommy says, well, it might have been that I had German measles. And she never met. She was like that. She did not. I was always trying to get her to say how brave she was during the war. Don't be ridiculous, darling, she'd say. That's absurd. We were all 18. We all thought we'd live forever. She would not let me get sentimental or emotional about the fact her 2 dogs were shot and thrown in the ocean.
Buried at sea.
Yeah, buried at sea. So,
Her
all those
corgis.
kinds of things.
Yeah.
Sort of a weird.
Do you think that the MI5 experience contributed to her being so closed off? And
Yeah.
okay, so
I
it
think
wasn't an English thing.
It was
necessarily.
both.
Okay.
It was definitely an English thing,
So
too.
double whammy.
Double whammy. But I remember when the word started to come out about Bletchley in the 1990s or early 2000s, Mommy was furious that those people were speaking up. They had all signed the Official Secrets Act. So that when Daddy jumped into France, he thought Mommy worked in the passport office. And he didn't tell her where he was jumping, because, of course, probably he didn't actually know, but they didn't discuss it. And that's what the sort of premise of the book is, that they got used to keeping secrets from one another from the very get-go. So they kept secrets in the marriage, which is why we always felt there was some sort of murky underworld going on.
And you were correct.
And we were right. We were right. And we were always trying to figure out the secrets. Even though Joe ran a private telephone line. We started out
I love
trying to
this.
run it. We were trying to run it through the sewers, the storm sewers of Washington, and I was the only child who was the right height. So Joe was on a pallet with wheels on it, rolling along on his back with the wire, and I could stand up with the flashlight and knock the slugs off the walls, and you could hear the rats in the, it was a storm sewer. And Joe had this idea. We were running it, by the way, into the house of Dick Bissell, who was the deputy director of the CIA. And, they were always...
You are the daughter of Spies.
And Dick's son, Rich, had already dropped a microphone down his chimney. So, he'd already done that, but we were going to top it. And so we got to Reno Road in Washington, and Joe assumed that the sewer would follow the road. Well, it didn't. We ended up in the middle of some park across the street. Can you imagine people driving back and forth on Reno Road? Out come these two children. Joe has got a huge black coil of wire. He's got his pallet with its. I've got the flashlight and the bucket
And the slugs.
and the slugs, and we're just crossing the street. In the end, he and Rich ran that telephone line through the trees. It followed the actual, telephone wires. It was amazing. They went up trees, whatever. And so during this whole thing, I think in the sewer, I said to Joe, now, remind me why we're doing this? And he said, this is so they can't hear what we're saying. And I remember thinking, do they care what we're saying? I mean, not exactly.
It was elaborate.
It was elaborate. Plus, Joe, we also bugged Daddy's dinner party.
Yes.
Remember, he went to Daddy, and Daddy said to him, I bet you can't bug a dinner party without me knowing about it. Joe said, okay, it's a deal, $50. So we ran a wire right up the leg of the table right by Daddy's chair, and under the rug, etc. And Joe taped it on a Wallensack reel-to-reel tape recorder, which is as big as a suitcase. The next day, that evening, we came in, we stuck it on his table, and we hit play. Now, to be honest, most of what you heard were the clink of glasses and but you could hear voices. And Daddy said, I don't believe this. He stood up and he peeled off 5 $10 bills. And it started Joe down a life of crime, because then he bugged the headmaster's study at the Groton School and took tape recordings of all the faculty meetings. I mean, it's funny because my friends whose parents were in the CIA, they all said, we never did anything about this. We knew they were all sneaking around telling secrets, and we never knew where Daddy went, and he was station chief in this place or that. And they said, but you guys did something about it.
You did. Indeed,
Not
you did.
that it really came out with, we didn't find any real secrets, but it was.
So I have a question. What was more daunting, running the telephone line or digging that enormous hole in your yard?
I don't know. They were equally daunting. The thing about Joe was that when you did come in and Mommy was in bad shape, Joe was in the basement, and he just ran us around. He was the downstairs father, and you repaired to the basement because it was safe. Even though he ordered you around all the time, it was kind of a relief because you didn't have to worry about what was going on upstairs. So the digging of the hole happened because Joe decided that our parents weren't being serious enough about a bomb shelter. And Daddy had said to Mommy that he thought that they ought to build a bomb shelter and go down it with Polly and Kim Roosevelt. And Mommy said, I can't stand Polly Roosevelt. How could we possibly last in a bomb shelter together? And he said, but there'll be 4 for bridge. Well, that was the end of that conversation. And so Joe decided we should dig our own bomb shelter. Of course, my parents were away. They were always away. And there was usually, somebody in the house supposedly who fed us, but they were so relieved when we just got out of their way. So we started digging. Now, in Washington, it's clay.
Yeah.
It's very hard to dig. So we dug in the heat of a Washington summer for about 3 hours, and then we quit. And Joe said, "What is wrong with you people?" And we said, "Well, you know, you're making us drag these buckets down the hill, bring them back up the hill. This is ridiculous." So Joe said, "Go away, come back tomorrow, and I will have solved the problem." So Joe figured out a bucket system. You put the dirt in the bucket, it shot down the hill on a wire, it hit a tree branch, it tipped upside down, and the empty bucket came up.
It's very Rube Goldberg.
It was totally Rube Goldberg. We dug a 14-foot hole. We dug a huge room out. We spent the night down there. There was, you know, roots of trees and small animals down there with us, and we had our Coke bottles and our comics. But the problem was, then Daddy came home. And Joe said, "Daddy, we've dug a bomb shelter." "Oh, have you, darling? That's sweet. How nice. Would you like to see it?" "Well, of course, yes. We'll come see it." So he goes out there. We give him our extension ladder, which it takes to get down to the bottom of the hole. He goes down. He comes back up. He goes like this. And the next day, he has a carpenter come and build a huge, immovable wooden top to the hole. And we were furious. We said, "Well, you know, we've spent hours digging this hole.
Days.
This is to save us from the
Yeah.
bombs." He said, "I've had to redo the liability in my insurance." I mean, and we never got to go down the hole again.
You should have come to my house. I'll add that
Yes.
a few blocks away, my mother built a bomb shelter, not by herself,
Oh,
but we
okay.
had a bomb shelter.
Really? Did
Yeah.
you dig it? No.
No. We had someone do it. But I loved it. It was a great
Yeah.
place to hide.
It is. Bomb
Yeah.
shelters were
Yeah.
great. Yeah. So true.
So I have to tell you that one of the things that struck me most about your book, and it's very personal, I was so disarmed to hear that your mother was great in a crisis.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
is responsible for that?
The war. Keep calm and carry on. You've got bombs dropping around you. You go out for dinner with a man and you don't think you'll ever see him again. She was built that way. She was made that way. It was part of what attracted Daddy to her, because he was a complete mess in a kitchen sink. I mean, he had been kicked out of Yale for taking all the hubcaps off the policemen's cars. And then he took a woman into the fraternity or something at 5 in the morning, which he wasn't supposed to do, and so he couldn't graduate with his class. But he was always like that. He had a Scottish nurse who did everything for him. So by the time Mummy met him, you know, she was always finding the keys he dropped. She gave him the medals that came back from her only brother who was killed in the war. And he supposedly had a St. Christopher medal, and he leaned off the boat when he was shipping to Italy to fight, and they fell out into the water. And he thought, "Oh my God, I'm going to die now because I've lost these medals." I mean, that's the way he was. Mummy was brilliant at pulling him together. And I think,
I find it amazing.
yeah, she really was. She was very efficient, very closed off. As you know, she didn't hug us. She didn't say, "I love you." She called me love. But she was a British, you know, she had that British reserve, but incredible amount of sort of stalwart bravery.
But what I find, I'll explain why I'm so disarmed. In her own way, and forgive me, personally, she just very much fell apart.
Yeah.
But she was able to rise to the occasion and pull herself together for something external.
Exactly. And I think that had to do with growing up during the war, because that's what you had to do. You had to pull yourself together. You had to get the furniture out of the burning building down the street when the bomb hit, you know. So she was good at that. It was the day-to-day interaction with her children. She found us all rather mystifying. And I think that was really, she had this inner strength that you could sense. But, you know, when you arrive here, you've come across, you're pregnant with your first child, you've had a miscarriage already, your father, your husband arrives actually very quickly before she even did. He came over on the Queen Mary. And within a month, the first person she sat next to at dinner was Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice. She was a very shy 18-year-old. And that was part of why she self-medicated with with alcohol. Because,
I frankly can understand
yeah,
that.
because she thought I can be okay in the table, you know.
Yeah.
I won't. But unfortunately, she overdid it at the British Embassy one night, and Daddy said never again, because he had to carry her out of there, and she ended up drinking with the bottle under her bed. He knew it, but he didn't tell any of us. So it was a weird experience.
Can you talk about the tremendous amount of research you were able to do thanks to your mother's holdings?
Yeah, the
which
basement.
I still marvel at.
So my mother was a bit of a pack rat, and when we moved her, I actually sent Stuart down to Washington. It was probably, I don't remember exactly the time, but it was late 90s, and we were getting very worried about her in an 11-bedroom house. And Stuart was one who could get her to do something when the rest of us couldn't. So he went down there and he said, "You have to move. You cannot stay in this house any longer." And she called me up the next day and said, "Stuart says I have to move." And I said, "Well, Stuart's right." So we moved her to in her opinion, a small house, 4 bedrooms. And everything that came out of the basement just moved into the other basement. Now, she had all sorts of documentation from Gibraltar. She grew up in Gibraltar. So we had deeds and birth certificates and all sorts of things like that. Then she had all the stuff from my father's family. None of the important papers, Daddy and Uncle Joe's papers or Library of Congress, you know, none of that. But the personal stuff,
Which
all
is
of
the
her,
most important in many
which
ways.
is the most important.
Yeah.
And my oldest brother, Joe, was very generous, and so I said, "Joe, we have to go through all these things, because Theodore Roosevelt was Daddy's great-uncle, my great-great-uncle, and we could find something in there that would be historically important," which, in fact, we did.
You did.
We found a letter from him to his sister that nobody had ever seen before. So Joe paid, and I had 3,900 documents and photographs scanned. So they are all digitized. And it saved me, because it really helped me. When Mummy was slipping into dementia, I would go into the basement and I would bring up a letter Daddy had written about her, and I would read it to her. Or I would bring up her great-uncle Wilfred's commission to be a lieutenant, and I would read it to her. And it just bring her back to me. You know, she couldn't remember who would come for lunch, but she would totally hear something like that and give me another detail. And that was an incredible experience. So it took me years to do that research, but I found out so much about her that I had never known and the boys had never known. So it was worth it.
Well, we were thankful that she was a pack rat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely we were thankful.
Would you like to talk to us about Mrs. L?
Yes, Mrs. L was Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She was TR's daughter, and you remember TR says, "I can either run the country or Alice, but not both." She was fantastic. Her granddaughter, Joanna, and I went to the same Catholic school, and Mrs. L always came to pick us up on Thursday in a great big ancient Cadillac, and she was allowed to go to the front door. Nobody else was, but Mrs. L was allowed to pick us up there.
One would dare not stop her.
No, you did not. And when you got into the car, she was inevitably sitting in full lotus position, and if she was showing off, which drove Joanna crazy, she would recite the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And, you know, Joanna would be rolling her eyes saying, "Grammy, stop it, you're showing off." We would drop Joanna at a farm where she rode Arabian horses, and then I got to go have tea with Mrs. L. But the funniest thing about driving with Mrs. L was we would be in the back street, Turner was in the front, and Turner drove by ear. So we'd be driving along, and Mrs. L would say, "Turner, I think you hit something back there." And he'd say, "Yes, ma'am, I think I did." And, you know, people would be driving by going at us, and Turner was completely implacable. You know, he just kept going. I would go up, they would have the amazing teapot that you pour through whatever, and she did have that famous pillow. If, you have something nasty to say, come sit by me. And I think part of the reason that we got along so well is that, like you, Tim, I was an eavesdropper. And I, of course, was always figuring out what Mommy was doing, what Daddy was doing, who was coming for dinner, and she wanted to know.
You had the latest gossip.
I had the latest gossip, and she loved that. What was, what was Joan Braden wearing yesterday? Did she get it at Dorcas Hardin? All that kind of stuff. And the great thing was that in the writing of the book, in the middle of writing it, I got an email from a man in England named Michael Cullinane, who had transcribed many, many tapes of interviews with the Roosevelts that nobody had ever transcribed.
How did he get them?
I don't know where he found them. I think they were historically in some archive, but nobody ever typed them up, and so he did. He put them all together.
This is quite a story.
And he wrote to me, and he said, "Do you realize that Mrs. Longworth did a whole 2 or 3 minutes on you?" And I said, "No." And he sent it to me, and you can hear it. And she's saying, "Oh, that little child." She said, "She's so prim, and she sits in her little chair in her little flower dress." She said, "But she's a wicked, wicked child."
A minx. A minx.
She's a minx. She's a minx. She said, "I have a very strange way of speaking. It's kind of peculiar." And it was. It's sort of like a faux Oxford accent. And she said, "She imitates me perfectly." And I didn't remember any of this. I was 6 at the time.
You were 6.
But I feel like, I have joined the Wicked Child Club. I'm so excited.
Which she loved.
She loved.
Oh,
She
yeah.
loved that. She loved being one, and she
Yeah.
loved anointing me as one. It's great. It was great. Yeah, no, it was fun. She was a classic.
Are you still up for a reading?
Yes. Now, should we discuss what I'm going to read?
Elizabeth and I had a debate. And I want to win. The debate being that the book is so emotional for me, I have to say. And the part that Elizabeth wanted to read, please don't. I have to say, I burst into tears reading it. I said, read something funny. We need it. I don't want to leave here in a cascade of tears.
All right, so I've agreed to do
Oh,
what
good.
Tim tells me to do. However, there are people in this audience who have heard this, so I am asking forgiveness for yet a second reading of a piece.
But how many people have seen a movie more than one time?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And if it makes you laugh, that's good. So, and it also involves a number of characters in the story. My mother was never a fashionable dresser. When she was growing up in Gibraltar, her mother and the dressmaker chose all her clothes. During the war in England, when they couldn't get their hands on extra material, she made do with 1 or 2 outfits for work and a Sunday dress for church. For her wedding, she'd had her tennis dress, the only white outfit in her closet, altered for the ceremony. She was someone who made do and was proud of it. But when she came to America, my Uncle Joe decided that making do was not good enough. As he wrote to a friend, quote, "Tish looked ethereal and lovely, but she seemed to have done her hair by butting a hedge fence, and her clothes appeared to have been thrown at her, more or less at random, by a rather tasteless friend standing at a considerable distance." You can see why Tim wanted me to read this. As he felt that Stu and Tish were, quote, letting down the partnership, he took over, as he was prone to do. He designed my mother's clothes, ordered dresses from his Hong Kong tailor, and took her shopping at Dorcas Hardin, the chic Georgetown dress shop that she would never have dared enter on her own. So it's not surprising that she had no idea how to dress an American girl. My mother seemed to find all her children mystifying, but most of all me, perhaps because I came after the two boys, or because she'd never had a sister, or because she and her mother weren't close. One day, on the way to school in carpool, I asked her if I could have a bra. Without thinking, she said, "But whatever for, dear?" She was right, of course. I didn't have the breasts for a training bra, but sitting in the front seat next to her, I shrank away into silence and prayed she wouldn't bring it up again. She didn't. In the 6th grade, when I was the last girl in dancing school, still wearing black patent leather shoes and little white socks, I screwed up my courage and asked her if I could please have stockings. She looked as if she found this request peculiar. Really? What color? What color? Aren't all stockings the same color? The question threw me so far off that my mind went completely blank. She was waiting for an answer. Whenever my mother had to wait on one of us, I could sense a tapping foot, a ticking clock. Her patience was running out. "Black," I blurted out, the first thing that came to mind. She frowned and then shrugged. "Black? Are you sure?" "No, of course I didn't want black stockings. What a ridiculous idea. Mummy, forget that." I wanted to say, "Why did you ask me for a color? Stockings don't have a color. They look like your legs." But the conversation was over, and I couldn't think of a way to rewind the tape. The next day, I found a pair of black tights on my bed. Thick black tights. The kind they probably wore in England when she went to the Catholic boarding school with its drafty rooms and no central heat. What mother would send her 12-year-old daughter to dancing school in a blue smocked short-sleeved dress with a white collar ordered by her grandmother from Harrods in London and black wool tights? Mine. Since Ian and I were only 13 months apart, we were enrolled in the same class at Mrs. Shippen's dancing school. As we headed out the door to get into the car where my mother was waiting, my father, settled in his comfortable easy chair in the living room, put down his paper for a moment to look at me. "Good heavens," he remarked. "Next time I see you, you'll be reading Mein Kampf." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was worried. Instead of fading into the crowd of girls lined up on one side of the room or primping in the bathroom, I was going to stand out like a sore thumb. I should have stuck with the little white socks. It seemed the 2 hours would never end. Even Mrs. Shippen, who usually sat like Queen Victoria in stern, lumpish silence on her throne at one end of the room, gasped as I passed by. Nobody actually pointed, but I could feel the eyes burning into my back, and I could hear the muffled whispers and giggles. Later, Ian told me that he took pity on me and bribed one boy to dance with me. His classmate, Al Gore, of all people, steered me woodenly around the room in the one obligatory dance they'd agreed to and hurriedly returned to the boys' side to collect his dollar. I went back to the White Sox until I could save enough allowance to buy my own stockings at Murphy's 5 and Dime on Wisconsin Avenue. If my mother noticed, she didn't mention it.
Shall we? Oh, go ahead.
Questions?
Sorry.
Questions? Q&A?
Yeah.
Hi, is there any way that your spy parents ever interacted or were on a job together or?
Good question. No.
Are you certain?
You mean, well, Mommy was a decoding agent. So she worked for MI5, not Bletchley. She worked at 55 Broadway in London.
Yeah, I mean Tim's parents.
Oh,
Oh.
Tim. Oh, well,
Because
we
you said
do.
your parents, your mother was a librarian.
Well, we think he wrote the report on Uncle Joe.
We think that my father did write the
Wow.
report.
So
My father was not a fan of the Alsops. I will say
No.
that.
and his father was number 2 to.
Well, he was Hoover's right hand. Number 2 was actually Clyde Tulsa.
Right, but he was, and didn't he write reports and,
Yes.
and speeches?
My
So-
father was Hoover's ghostwriter, basically. He was an agent,
Wow.
but he wrote all of his correspondence and his speeches and his books.
And our uncle was caught in bed with a man in Moscow in 1957.
And it was a setup.
Yeah, it was a setup, it was a compromat, because Uncle Joe was a closeted gay man. And when he came out, it's a long story, but when he got up to Moscow, they were gonna sort of lock him away and keep him there to try and turn him. And he refused. And he got to Moscow with his friend Chip Boland, who was the ambassador, and Chip Boland sent him to Paris, where his friend Frank Wisner was chief of station for the CIA. And Frank said, you write everything down, everything about your life. So they have nothing on you that we don't have. And it was just, it's a very, 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 very sad letter about how he tried not to be gay and blah, blah, blah. And that was sent on to Hoover. So Uncle Joe was sent pictures 2 or 3 times, so they think by the KGB, of him in bed with this man. And the difference between now and then is that then the people who got the pictures, and one of them was Art Buchwald, and he and Uncle Joe couldn't stand one another because Uncle Joe had written a play, or Art Buchwald had written a play about Uncle Joe called Sheep on the Runway, which played on Broadway, and if you came to see it, Uncle Joe wouldn't let you in the house again. So there was no love lost between them. But when Art Buchwald got those photographs, he just put them in an envelope and sent it back to Uncle Joe. And I don't think that would happen these days. Different.
That was very honorable.
Yeah, it was. Both cases. David.
You tell this with such good humor and such grace, but your relationship with your mother sounds like it was a shipwreck. Do you still talk to your mother, and are you bitter about your relationship at all? Or how do you feel, and did the book expiate that feeling?
It's a good question. The book definitely helped. So what happened was we had a very absent mother. We had a physically present parents and emotionally absent, even when they were with us. When I wrote the book, Knock Knock, Who's There, and we had that come to Jesus moment, and then it took about 2 or 3 more years, Mommy was sober. She stopped drinking the day my son was born, and she was carried out of the house in a straitjacket. So she never went back. So there were these wonderful years in between. My son was born when I was 28, and Mommy was 51. And until she was 81, she was okay. And she supported me, and I had a very nasty divorce, and she came up and sat in the courtroom, and she tried to send me money, and she was very much there. And then she slid into dementia. My brothers and I like to think it was alcohol dementia because we don't want to inherit Alzheimer's. And the doctor said to me that her brain cells did not recover from all of those years of drinking. But what happened to me in that dementia time was I was triggered, and I felt exactly the way I did as a child. So if she would snap at the caregivers, I would think I have to protect them. But what happened with the research and finding out what she'd really been through and sitting there with her and showing her the video that I did of her in London during the war or in Gibraltar, it gave us a way to be together so that I didn't resent anymore. And if she needed to talk about the Cardinal and the Bird Theater 3 times in an hour, I could be there with her. So it was a healing process. That's a very good question because it was a very tough childhood. I would not have survived if it had been alone. To have the boys, the 6 of us, were all very different, but we're very tribal. And they are incredibly loyal to me. And early on, when I knew I was the first child, the only girl, and the closest physically to Mommy when she slid into dementia, I got in touch with the boys. I said, guess what? You're going to pay me. They all agreed without a murmur. I said, I'm not charging full rate, $40 an hour and travel. But and I said, and you're not off the hook either. I said, there's 6 of us and 7 days in the week. So everybody has a day to call, and then they would come in and visit, and they were completely supportive. And I think that saved all of us, was having the tribe. Good question, long answer to a short question. Roger.
I was interested that you quoted some of your Uncle Joe's letters. I wonder whether people have saved or returned to you your father's letters, and whether you see a book in the letters of either of them. They probably weren't corresponding to one another, but they certainly corresponded to interesting people, and books of letters are always fascinating too.
That's a good question. I feel like they've been written about so much that actually, the book I would like to do, but I probably won't because somebody else is doing it, is to write about Daddy's war. What happened with the letters was all the important political stuff is collected at Library of Congress. But there was a moment in my mother's office where I said to her, what is that box in the corner? And she said, when your Uncle Joe died, your brother Joe inherited most things. He brought those over here. And they're all personal letters. So she said, I think I'll throw them out. I said, no. Don't do that. And those letters are pretty amazing about the time JFK came to his house after, the inauguration, and he wrote a lot to Susan Mary, who became his wife, and they were divorced. But it was really that correspondence, and that hasn't been seen by anybody. So I don't know. I think that belongs in a way to to his stepchildren more than to me. But there might be a point in those. They were very good writers. I think it's the reason Uncle Joe decided to take on Daddy as a partner was because Daddy wrote 207 pages of letters from the war and from England and everywhere he was, and they were really good letters. And my grandmother had them all copied. And so we have totally digitized copies of them. Those are really worth reading. It's a good question.
This might be a corollary on the question, but because it sounds like it really did kind of take a village to get your mother. Her dementia was not short and sweet. She didn't exit, swiftly.
4 years.
And those were long 4 years. And I loved this memoir / autobiography. And for me, what was just so poignant was you'd had a tough childhood and you were so dear, and with the help of the brothers, but my God, she was a tough cookie, and then she was absent in a whole other way.
Yeah.
To me, it felt like kind of a double whammy to have your mom finally back, and then Jesus, she gets dementia. It's not fair, she's finally back. So it was so poignant when you would ride around with her, and she'd be like, "We're going for a ride," a long ride, round and around. But often it seemed like if you brought up something about Gibraltar, then boom, you got her back, which worked for her and you. It was such a little win-win,
Yeah, the slightest thing, you would be surprised. I remember when Stuart went down to visit, when she finally had to go into a nursing home in the last 6 weeks, and he called me and said, "What do we talk about?" Because she couldn't hit the ball over the net anymore. And I said, "Show her the videotape." And by that time, she didn't even know it was her voice speaking. Sometimes she would say to me, "Well, this is exactly like my story," or "Whose voice is that?" And that was at the very end. But she could also say, one day she said to me, I said, "What did your father do during the war?" And she said, "Oh, he was in the Dad's army." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "The Home Guard." So the great moment was when she was looking at a picture of the coronation of King George VI after Edward abdicated. And I said, "Well, why are you all dressed up, Mommy? And the dogs all have bows on their necks." And she said, "That's the coronation in Gibraltar. We all came out." And she said, without missing a beat, she said, "Hark the herald angels sing. Mrs. Simpson stole our king." That's nothing.
I just want to say it's a beautiful way you weave from one voice to another through the history, your personal experience, and I thought the band of children was just so inventive, and what I thought you did so well was to tell the story of digging the hole, but then having it covered, it was heartbreaking. And you back off from interpreting how to feel about these incredible stories, so it's just a pleasure to read.
Thank you. When I first started the book, I thought I would just write Mommy and Daddy's love affair, but then it fell flat on the page because everybody knew I wasn't there and been born, and everything had to be reported. And then I thought, no, I'm going to talk about what it's like to take care of my mother during dementia and weave it in. However, please notice in part 2, when I'm talking about my childhood, no mother. I wanted full spotlight on me. I shared the stage with her in a certain way for so long, and I was shocked by how her dementia triggered that same emotion of a child feeling like I'm going to have to walk through another minefield here. So that's why the braided narrative, I was told later that's what it was called. And that made a big difference, that I could put myself right there. Because I could say things like, I don't want to think about bed sores. I want to go back to when she was 18 and beautiful and, in the war. So do we have time for any more?
Yeah, maybe 1 or 2 more questions if that's
Okay.
good with you. I have one here in the live stream. If you,
Let's
toss
do
this in at the end, by all means. Sorry, now I've lost it. Elizabeth, how do your feelings about the publication of this memoir compare with your feelings about the publications of your children's books or your other books?
The publishing process, let's go down that. I feel this is a triumph. I feel that I didn't really think I could write a memoir. I've clung to fiction for so long, and I've put people's feelings, what I really felt, I hid in my characters. Here I had to come out from behind the curtain and say, this is what I feel, this is what I care about. I don't feel that I have overexposed anything. I don't feel there's anything gratuitous in this. It's honest, but I also hope that people come away saying, wow, there was a rapprochement between the mother and daughter here. And particularly what I call her postcard from the grave, where she literally, I found these notes she did for a hospice, I think it was for a speech to hospice people, and I realized not only was my mother a great storyteller, she did live an examined life. And so that almost closed it off like a cat.
I'm just interested, did you have to clear this with your family when you were thinking about writing? And how did that go?
Did I have to clear it with my family? No, I didn't ask permission. I wrote the whole thing, and then I held my breath, and I sent it to all 5 brothers, and they were all pretty positive about it. Right, Stuart?
Well, you all know how well written it is. What a great story.
And I think also that we discovered, I did and then they did, a lot about Mommy that none of us knew. Or she'd been so secretive and so closed down. And that was a blessing to make her no longer a footnote.
And it is easier to ask forgiveness than permission.
Yeah. As Tim will tell me many times. Thank you guys. You've been great.